Thank you.
Hi everyone, so thank you Charlotte and Walpole for having me back. It's great to be here, and especially in the privileged company of British icon and photo royalty. Charlotte actually, I think, covered quite a lot of my intro, so I'm going to kind of get into the conversation quite quickly, because I know we've unfortunately got the hangry time, so, so bear with us. But I think all of us are familiar with Rankin's work as a touch point, and on a personal note, I just wanted to mention that as someone who works across contemporary culture, strategy and access to the visual arts, he has served for nearly 2 decades of my own career actually as a cultural touch point, as an innovator, and someone who's consistently and constantly breaking boundaries, and I'm sure for many of you too. So I'm excited today that we're actually going to be switching the lens around onto Rankin himself and looking at him not just as a photographer and an artist, but speaking with him also about the other parts of his work, about his groundbreaking publishing companies, the way in which that he has created an eponymous business of his own, a consultancy, Rankin Creative, and of course we'll be discussing Britishness. Are we too British about being British in luxury, and what does image making mean, how it's evolved in a post-COVID world, and how content creation is continually moving forward? So before we get into some of those topics, I wonder, Rankin, for those who are less familiar with maybe the history of your work and where it all started, you grew up in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the personal journey of how you found and unleashed this creativity in photography?
Thank you, and thanks for letting me be here. So not a lot of people know that much about me in terms of my background, because being a photographer is essentially being behind the lens. I hate being in front of lots of people and being in front of the lens, but you have to do that because you have to be able to communicate what your ideas are. And my background is a Glaswegian family, very working class. But my parents, apart from being Glaswegian and a bit of a contrarian because I'm Scottish, my parents never ever said no to me when I asked why. And every time I asked why, they would try and find an answer. And that kind of encouragement to be inquisitive allowed me to really kind of find myself creatively, because I didn't have any background in terms of creativity. Nobody in my family had any creativity. But when I found it, I was like, this is what I want to do. And because my parents had said to me, you can be whoever you want to be, I went, yeah, I did it. So literally the first day I picked up a camera, I looked through the lens and I went, this is it, I found what I want to do. And it was really about being able to show the world how I saw the world.
And I think what's fascinating is the way you talk about the lens and the camera as a vessel, and almost this kind of mix, I suppose, of vision making and psychology, and also kind of transporting yourself through others' personalities. And through your background, you obviously were in Glasgow and then Yorkshire, and you've yet still become a very central, I suppose, purveyor and creator of luxury.
Yep.
So how did your experience, do you think, shaped your own personal view of what luxury is or was at the time?
I think because I came from that background where there was no creativity, I was like a sketchbook that was empty. So everything that I came to in terms of creativity, I found myself. And I think that gave me a real belief in my own views. And because I've got that contrarian part of me, when it comes to something like luxury or anything to do with creativity, I've got that very specific view. And I think that I'm the kind of kid, you know, that when I was younger, I was like, why is the emperor wearing new clothes? You know, so I go into a room with a brand and I ask the questions that maybe other people don't ask. And I think that it's very difficult for sometimes for brands to accept that, but it means that I'm really questioning everything that they're about. And I think in today's world where the digital revolution has turned everything upside down, what it's meant is that we have to entertain our audience. We have to treat the consumer like an audience member, and we have to entertain them. And that way of connecting with them, because I started magazines, I really understand.
And I think that trust and your boldness in your vision also creates trust with your subjects, because they know that you are going to effectively be treating them as the artist and not from a brand perspective, which I'm assuming is also why you are able to evoke such sensitive and emotional, and a lot of the portraits that you will have seen and kind of across the last few decades, really iconic imagery of Kate Moss to Tony Blair to the Rolling Stones to leaders of industry, and of course the Queen and her smiling image. Those are very rare captures, and they come from a pure place of integrity.
Absolutely, and the thing is that what I'm doing there is collaborating with the person. I'm not going there to steal something from them. I'm going there to make something with them. And I think that approach was, when I first started it back in the 90s, I think people were just surprised that people wanted to make something together. And that's what I've kind of tried to do my whole career. To the point now that I've really got to the point where I can trust the person to choose the picture I think is the best of them.
Yeah. And I think what's important is a lot of your photography isn't just about celebrities and leaders and those who are sort of in control or in charge. You obviously have done your portrait projects, Rankin Live, where I think, did you shoot 1,600
people in 3 months, yeah. And what happened when I did that was I started to, it's like the 10,000 hours Malcolm Gladwell thing. I just started to realise that I had this instinct about people within the moment, and I could tell what they liked and what they didn't like about themselves. And I learned how to really lean into that. And I think that gave me, it's like I got better at it by doing it.
And you also led the way with the Dove campaign as well in terms of real imaging of people. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your work in activism as well, because this lays foundation for some later questions, but particularly your work in the Congo.
Yeah, well, when I started to become successful as a photographer, I realised that I really needed to balance up. I was making a lot of money, I was doing really well. And if I didn't balance up my moral sort of compass, then I would not really kind of be able to look my son in the eye. So I went to Oxfam and I said, look, I think that there's a real opportunity with what you're doing in certain countries, but you're kind of creating this victim-led kind of approach. And I said, imagine if you took what I do with celebrities and applied that to people. And they said, okay, that sounds interesting, but where would you go? And I said, well, where's the place that the least number of people feature in the media? And they said the Congo. So I went to the Congo, and it was extraordinary for me because I took my camera, but I also took a printer, and I photographed all these people that were displaced in Goma. And it was incredible because I lost my translator at the beginning because there was an interviewer going out doing interviews. So I had to communicate visually with them, with the people, because also I couldn't speak the language.
Yeah.
And what happened was it really allowed me. I put a white background up and photographed the people that were displaced, and I created these images. And what happened was the kids and the people that were being photographed could see their picture, and it was almost like an empowerment for them. They felt like they were seen. And I went to there was like a little kind of market in the camp, and I took the pictures and I put them up in the camp, and I had this private view where like about 4,000 people descended on these pictures and were looking at them. And one guy took his picture and he said, I'm going to use this as the photograph on my coffin for when I die. And I think it's the kind of most extraordinary private view I've ever been to, whilst also allowing me to come back to the UK and talk about the people and what they were going through. And I think that exchange, because it was an exchange, it wasn't me sensationalizing the victimhood of them. It was me trying to give them give them a platform that meant that I can actually get up and talk about it. And I think that we raised something like about £1 million just from that project. And then from there on in, I always thought I'll always balance the projects I'm doing commercially, because I believe in commerciality. I think it's really important, but I'll always balance it with some sort of purpose. And then, of course, doing the Dove campaign, it was a very easy conceit. It was like, why do we have idealized people in fashion imagery?
Leading the way.
Why don't we have real people? It's just a really straightforward concept. Luckily, I was in a room with a guy called Dennis Lewis, and he said, how would you do this if we were going to photograph real people? And I said, I would just photograph them like real people.
Well, I mean, you were nearly 20 years ahead of the curve, because I feel like when COVID hit, obviously, every brand started looking at the real person and how people were starting to tell stories, and actually sort of when we talk about the influencer or the advocate, true advocacy has sort of shone through, and I think that's something that you have done incredibly well.
Yeah, and I think the problem is now the audience they've got their hands on this technology, so because they've got their hands on it, they're flipping back. So you've got like really crazy things like, retouching on phones for 14-year-olds, and they're using it in a way which is really, back in the day when we used Photoshop, it was really criticized.
Yeah.
Now you've got kids using it and no one's really talking about it. And that's quite scary for me because, as an industry, the marketing industry cleaned itself up and sorted itself out. No retouching, really honest imagery, and then now kids are doing it to themselves.
Well, that intergenerational dialogue is also something that I know we've talked about, of this idea of grassroots culture and who creates culture and who sells culture, and often there is a very big divide and gap between the two. So if you're a luxury brand, I mean, obviously you led the way in this through your publishing houses, and through Dazed, which was obviously an iconic co-founded publication with Jefferson.
Yeah.
What do you think was the sort of secret sauce and the enduring nature of that?
I think when we set up Dazed, I went to college to be a photographer, and the day I walked into college, they gave me a magazine. And when I got that magazine, the student magazine, I was like, I'm going to do that. And I did it in parallel. And I think when we learned on the job making magazines for the student union. So when we set up Dazed, it was very much a matter of kind of going, okay, why do we want to do a magazine? And it became a kind of Trojan horse of kind of creativity. So we took all the things that we loved and put them into this kind of glossy editorial piece. But actually, there was some subversive stuff in there that made people question everything that was going on in the 90s at the time, and taking art and kind of intersecting it with music, taking kind of really good writers and intersecting them with fashion shoots. And that way of working became something that we did it because we really wanted something that was like that. And then once we'd done it, everybody started doing it.
Well, it's all, like a pinboard of cultural reference almost, which is something that has continued on. And as a culture maker, where do you personally get your own cultural reference?
Oh, that's a really good one. I think everywhere. I think the thing is that if you want to be a provocateur or an innovator, you have to be looking everywhere for material. You can't be just looking in the same place all the time. And I think also you have to really accept that today everything is so far removed from what it was that if you're not looking at TikTok, you're not looking at what people are doing on new social media platforms, you get left behind.
Yeah, and that voice seems to encapsulate a lot more than it did before, this idea of activism, behavioural change, diversity, and where you pick up those references. And I think it's a natural segue into this idea of not just you as the photography and the artist and the person who's capturing the image, but now you obviously have your own business and consultancy, Rankin Creative. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what Rankin Creative is.
Well, it's an agency, but it's an agency that tries to sort of unsilo all the different parts of the business. So, we take editorial and we put that at the heart of strategy, and we try to make ourselves think about, what are we actually doing in terms of creating a story for the brand, but also we try really, really hard to think about what be the brand guardian, but also be the questioner of the brand. And I think that I started it really because I really wanted to be at the heart of commissioning. I didn't want to be down the line. Yeah. I wanted to be at the heart and find out what was going on and work out how I could be part of that story.
And I think a lot of your work is really interesting in the way that kind of faces and takes into question some quite uncomfortable and quite difficult topics. And one of those has been around death. You did a large project with Royal London on how to die well, but previous to that, you'd obviously done exhibitions, and I think which was precipitated by the death of your own parents.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about
Well,
that.
I think it's really important to put culture at the heart of creativity. So if you don't have a cultural story to tell, then you're not going to be actually affecting any change within the audience. So for me, Royal London came from a couple of guys that got together and were trying to create a kind of benefit society for death. And they came to us and said, would you like to pitch on a proposal for creating purpose around the brand? And we said you should do something on death. So I pitched to them, which I still kind of am quite proud of, a book called How to Die Well, which had nothing to do with photography at all. It was about an introduction to death, to somebody that was terminally ill, somebody that's aging, and that came from essentially me having no understanding of death when my parents were getting ill. I just had nothing, and I thought, God, there's a real gap here. And then, of course, that happened just as COVID hit.
Yep.
And then that took on this massive, even bigger meaning. And what was brilliant about it is I remember having a conversation with the PR at Royal London. She said, why would anybody do PR around this? And I said, because it's so important that we have these types of conversations.
Yeah.
And what was brilliant for me is that once we'd done it, I think we did something like £20 million worth of PR. But every time I went on a broadcast channel, I was spending 5 to 10 minutes extra because the person that I was being interviewed by wanted to talk about death.
Personal story.
Yeah.
And I think what was really poignant when I was listening to some interviews of you talking about it was this idea that I think your mother sort of passed first.
Yeah.
And you were kind of saying to your dad, look, Dad, let's worry about Mum. And then suddenly your father passed away. So almost these images and the way you've made them have become this ongoing tool and a reference point on a much wider level. And on these kind of projects, there's obviously another one you've done with Coco de Mer, with FGM, with Waris Dirier. I think on the breadth of the way you're creating the content around these projects. Obviously, this is an unusual one for you of being the artist and the photographer, and so much of your work as a portrait and a visual artist. And then suddenly you find yourself in a space where you are kind of working with bigger teams, not always as the end point of taking the shot. How does that feel?
Feels amazing. I mean, we've just done a project for Switchboard, which is the LGBT switchboard. If you kind of are having thoughts of, I don't know if I'm gay or not, and my young producer, Jordan, has directed it. I couldn't direct that piece of work, and he's made this amazing short film about how it feels to be in that position where you're really not sure about your sexuality, you're really not sure about who you can speak to, you've probably told somebody and they've given you a hard time, and because I've kind of given him that platform, he can do that. I could never do that. And that gets really exciting because then you're going to go, actually, we're affecting proper change here. Like, this is going to really influence people. And that makes me very proud. But it also means that, if there's things within other categories that I can't do, somebody else can do it. But I can still have my opinion. I can still bring my expertise to the thing,
And how would you translate that, let's say, in some of the global brand leaders and directors who are in the room today? One of the challenges obviously can be operationally and going through teams and decision making, and the things that I know you and I have had the privilege to work on. You can be nimble, you can be quick, you can access a gritty creative, an artist off the street, a film content creator. And what would your advice be to luxury brands who, in the topic of the title obviously, are we being too British about Britishness? So is that linked directly to the image? And how do we enable, I suppose, a freedom of image making in the luxury sector? Yeah,
I don't think it's linked to the image. I think it's linked to the world. So the thing about culture at the moment is if you're looking at it just from a brand or marketing perspective, you're not understanding it. Brands have to start acting like people. The more they act like people, the more they have differences, different layers and opinions, and the more they'll connect with the audience, because the audience are an audience. They want to be connected to you. They don't want it to just be a one-way street. They want it to be a two-way street. And I think that for me, it's, culture is, we have a societal responsibility to be part of those kind of conversations. We've got to have purpose. If we don't have it, what's the point? And then people want you to be honest with them about you know, the fact you're selling to them. They don't want to be kind of like backdoored. They want it to be like, you know, an honest discussion.
Which goes into kind of the future making of niche communities and somewhat. And I hold the personal view that I think every larger brand is breaking down into smaller communities, and each community will own and create and control their own content, and in the future their own data streams, and those data streams will end up getting aligned. So we share conversations with like-minded brands and people.
Yeah, and collaborations and intersections and
exactly.
all
And
those
the
things.
campaigns you're working on now through Rankin Creative, a lot of those have sort of behavioural transitional change and kind of results-driven elements around how these communities are responding. And one community that I want to touch on, we are already running out of time, which is so depressing because I feel like it could go on for about 2 hours. But the community of the visual arts sector, which we've just seen in previous stats, obviously, is something that's growing. This idea of collectability, the elevation of photography. We've just had Photo London at Somerset House, which I hope many of you went to, and auction markets are growing with photography. Why, in an age of where brands are looking to the metaverse, to AI, to digital, why is a singular or a photograph still retain its importance?
Well, that's the biggest question ever. I mean, it's like I could take hours on that one. Because you have a relationship with it that is in the moment. You know, it's like I've got a Damien Hirst, and every single time I look at it, I have like a warm feeling towards it, and it's because it's mine and it's in my house, and I can go and look at it. And I think that, you know, that idea of experiencing something in real life is as exciting as doing it in any other dimension.
Yeah, there's a collectability, isn't there? And you've obviously translated between, because you've been in the V&A and in MoMA. And in terms of this Britishness concept, what would your advice be to the brands today around how they can innovate? Don't
think it's changing faster than ever. It's not. There's no end to this stuff. It's going faster and faster. AI, for example, people are talking about how it's going to influence them in the moment, but actually, how's it going to influence society? You know, this is beyond marketing or luxury. This is like, you know, how's it going to affect us as a wider societal community? And I think that if you want to know that, you know, the media aren't covering that stuff. You know, no one's covering the fact that Tristan Harris is, you know, doing some great work on talking about how these things are going to actually affect us. And I think if you've watched The Social Dilemma as a documentary, they're doing that on AI. And the AI question, it's a difference between, you know, creating. Basically, social media has kind of thrown everything and mixed it all up, and it's turned everything upside down. But that was curatorial. This is actual, you know, creation. And when you take curatorial, you know, democracy has been almost kind of gutted, and the way we communicate, the individual communication has been completely changed. How we communicate with each other has become mainly photographic. But when you do that beyond curatorial and it becomes creation, that's very, very scary. And we're not having those debates or discussions. And if I was a brand at this moment, I would be looking at what the actual reality of what AI will mean to society, not just to marketing.
And really, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. It's the fastest session ever, but Rankin will be here at lunchtime if you want to continue on the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.